Okay, hello everyone, and thank you very much for staying put for this last presentation of the day. It was extremely interesting to see the last two teams present, so hopefully you'll have some background to compare and contrast between approaches in these different schools. Our title for today is Enhancing Heritage Awareness and Sustainability for the Built Environment, an examination of indicative coursework in architectural and urban design at the University of Cyprus. It has been compiled with the help of at least 5 of our faculty members, headed by the leader of this project, Professor Philokipru, but also Professor Pila, from whom you heard earlier today, and Professors Kondovourkis and Michael, in addition to myself. Presentation outline. It's split into sections that start with an introduction to our curricular organizational chart and how subsequent points that are based on a taxonomy of courses fit into the structure of the programs in the Department of Architecture and the School of Engineering of the University of Cyprus. This will be followed by pedagogical approach in general and student profiles of our community in these courses. Then we will talk about course structures and outcomes, but also methodologies employed in a number of these courses. It will be a sampling of these courses, which are indicative of the structure of the degrees offered at the university. Some concluding thoughts at the end, trying to wrap up a few things that we have discovered along the way, and then a mention about a couple of parallel actions that you heard earlier today as well, but we'll reintroduce them here, that run concurrently with the HERSUS project. So in our first section, we're trying to introduce coursework in our department that deals with aspects of both architectural cultural heritage and related issues as they pertain to sustainable design and development. These are being taught not only by tenured and tenure-track faculty members, but also by adjunct faculty members, visiting faculty members, and by industry experts as well. We do this in order to try to introduce a number of different viewpoints across all our coursework, and to make connections both horizontally across programs, if you will, but then vertically between different courses that are being offered by the university. Typically, this coursework is geared towards more advanced students. So people who enter our courses come after some basic professional studies in architecture or related fields. They're mostly graduate students, and they are either in this interdepartmental master's course in the conservation and the restoration of historic buildings and sites, but also, and this is an interscholastic course. It includes departments from different schools, but also an interdepartmental program, which we're going to make mention of, which looks at energy technologies and sustainable design. So in addition to these students who come to take these very specific specialized graduate courses, our mix of students also includes doctoral students, but there are also openings for a limited number of students at the end of their 4-year undergraduate cycle. That would be the Bachelor of Science cycle, and also people who are in the diploma cycle, which is the 5th year in this 5-year curriculum. So in other words, students come from 4 different separate program cycles, if you will, the Bachelor of Science in Architecture, which, as we mentioned, is a 4-year cycle, the Diploma of Architecture course, which completes the 5-year cycle, which leads to a professional degree in architecture, the Interdepartmental Masters of Science course, which occurs with contributions by the Departments of Archaeology, Architecture, and Civil Engineering, the last two being from the School of Engineering, and with a specialization and a focus on the conservation and restoration of buildings, historic buildings and sites, and also with a number of Doctor of Philosophy students who are addressing individualized research in the themes mentioned above as part of their doctoral dissertations. The nature of this coursework, examples of which will appear in later slides, and we'll see how this plays out through examples of student work in the different courses offered, takes on the form of lectures, seminars, design workshops, and capstone projects. Capstone projects meaning projects that conclude, test, and allow the students to present competencies and methodological approaches that have been picked up through core courses and constrained elective courses, and they are usually group works. But in addition to this group work, which occurs in the Capstone Project, there is also individualized work as part of an independent study or a diploma project, or even a master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation. Most of our coursework is in the form of constrained electives. So these courses being, let's say, advanced courses, not introductory courses, they tend to being offered both as constrained electives for the graduate students, but also as elective courses for some of the undergraduate or doctoral students. They have these different, if you will, identities within their program frameworks, and they're usually work 8 credits in the context of constrained electives. Of course, individual projects, the Capstone Project, and other courses of that are the result of a final group work or final individual work, are assigned a greater number of credits, and they reflect a greater load of work or even custom deliverables. Now, as to the profile of our students at the bachelor's and diploma cycles, and these are usually consecutive to each other. So people who usually finish the 4-year bachelor cycle enter the 5th-year diploma cycle straight after. Perhaps in some cases, some of them take a gap year to either go and do individual research, engage in field trips, or engage in practice even, and then they come back and do their 5th year, which is the diploma year in this 4+1, if you will, structure of in this educational undergraduate context. And it is made up of people who are starting their studies in architecture straight out of high school after they take high school, Pan-Cyprian high school exams. And they receive their first professional degree after 5 years. This is the degree that allows them to be inducted into professional societies, technical chambers, and following, if you will, a supervised tenureship in offices in practice. They get their licenses and they're able to practice. In this cycle of studies, there are also some students who return to the university to get a second degree. These are usually slightly more mature students who kick the tires and tried their hand at other degrees, but made a more conscious decision, let's say, after studying anything from a related course, which may be in civil engineering or courses in planning, but also we have people who've come from degrees in medical and pre-medical studies, literature courses, and so on and so forth, who make a conscious decision to join their high school, if you will, colleagues in starting a second degree. All these students have the possibility and exposure to architectural heritage and sustainable design and development themes through this constrained elective coursework. On the other hand, the profile of our students at the master's and doctoral cycles is somewhat different in the sense that these are people that tend to have gone through professional cycles of studies in architecture or civil engineering or archaeology or in other related disciplines. They have entered practice in many cases, and they make a very conscious choice of returning to academia to receive specialized qualifications that reflect focused knowledge through the respective master's or doctoral cycles of study. A good number of them have had, as mentioned, prior experience in related academic coursework and or professional practice in exposure in a variety of fields, and they seek advanced study in both taught courses, but also in terms of realizing their research expectations, perhaps even with a change in career outlook from from practice into academia. Consequently, some of the coursework, which you will see presented here in later slides, serves in some cases as introductory coursework to these more specialized fields, while other coursework is aimed at advanced study and requires specialized tool sets and thought processes. So taking the structure of the master's course in the preservation and conservation of historic buildings and sites, you see reflected in this chart a few of the points raised before. So there are some core courses that all students engaged in these programs need to take, especially in this master's program. The titles speak for themselves: local and traditional building materials, history and critical theory of conservation, introduction to building archaeology. There are diploma courses which are open to the undergraduate students as well, and these reflect both group work and independent individualized study, but then also specialization courses. These are what we have called before constrained electives that are being offered by the three departments that contribute to this interscholastic program. And these are the department starting from the left to the right, the Department of Civil Engineering and Environmental Engineering, our own Department of Architecture, and the Department of Archaeology. Again, some indicative titles from which students can pick and choose and focus, if you will, their studies are advanced technology of materials, physical properties and related durability problems of construction materials, restoration and strengthening of structures, experimental methods of structural engineering, and masonry structures. These are some of the titles offered by the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. From our own department, courses with titles such as Environmental Building Design, Mediterranean Cities and Social Phenomena, Advanced Topics in Urban Planning looking at territorial transformations, urban design and sustainable development, and also specialized topics on recording and documenting buildings and sites. And from the archaeology department, courses such as the settlement analysis and spatial archaeology, urban archaeology, introduction to cultural heritage management, global issues and special cases in cultural heritage management, and built environment from prehistory to late antiquity. If we now start with some of the course descriptions that we have mentioned, these are indicative titles. We can see how these courses are structured, what are their methodological approaches. These will occur in bullet forms. And then I'll continue with a couple of or more slides for each of these courses so that you can see the product, the outcome from this coursework. So if we take a course such as the one shown here in Architecture and the Critical History of Ecology, this is offered by our colleague Pani Pila, who you heard from earlier today, this morning. It is a constrained elective course. It analyzes the history and theory of environmental issues in architecture in relation to a larger context of architectural theory and practice in the past 50 years. It also contemplates social and technological experimentations and architectural visions and their relation to history of the environment, science, and technology. It reflects critically and historically on more recent concepts that shape architectural theory and practice, such as eco-development, green architecture, sustainability, as well as market trends that influence architecture, such as eco-branding and greenwashing. This course also enriches the technical and practical courses of the program by enhancing students' theoretical knowledge and providing a critical historical perspective on sustainability. In terms of methodologies and teaching approaches, this specific course or this family of courses of which this course is representative combines both lectures and seminars in its format. Lectures tend to introduce students to key historical and theoretical concepts. They usually have a twofold goal. That is to analyze the historicity of concepts like sustainable development, nature, natural resources, resource conservation, environmental sensitivity, sustainability, and sustainable development, and also to present and provide key design strategies from histories, looking at garden cities, park systems, passive systems, well-tempered environments, green design, and ecological design, amongst others. The seminars, on the other hand, tend to cultivate the close reading of texts and to further unpack key concepts of the lectures and of the text presented therein through discussion of student assignments. Other tools include short-term projects and long-term projects. The short-term projects are usually weekly assignments and tend to produce either posters or collages that offer critical commentaries on the readings, and to establish, if you will, a class glossary, which is created in relation to key concepts that emanate from these readings. On the other hand, long-term research projects tend to connect ideas of the course to specific contemporary projects. They look at local practices, such as recent and contemporary practices in Cyprus, but also examine international practices from recent and contemporary practices globally. And here we see some of the byproducts of these short and long-term assignments. Long-term research projects that tend to look at local practices include such topics as the demolition of the Nicosia Hospital and questions on sustainability. Indicative questions that are being asked is, should the Nicosia Hospital be demolished or preserved? The students in this paper investigated the demolition of this piece of infrastructure and its adverse effects on the environments, and presented keywords or delved, or if you will, on keywords such as preservation, toxic materials, and eco-branding. Short student projects, on the other hand, have utilized the tool of collage making and poster making in offering critical commentaries on the readings through these tools. And topics have included or have been sort of entitled Falling Toxic, in which this group of students have contemplated the lessons of the text inherited toxicity in relation to the environmental problems mentioned therein, and they examine toxic materials and preservation issues in relationship to Frank Lloyd Wright's famous buildings, Falling Waters. Another project entitled Best Before emphasized the importance of design processes to set parameters both for the longevity and potential second life of buildings by portraying these factors as a systematic deliberation of production. A course offered by colleague Maria Philokipou, but also colleagues Michael and Kondovourkis, look at special topics on tools that help us and approaches that help us record and document both buildings, historic buildings, and historic sites. This course provides fundamental and specialized knowledge of recording and documenting buildings and building sites at the scale of territories, if you will, through the use of traditional but also conventional and contemporary digital methods. The investigation includes not only surveys of buildings using contemporary and digital equipment, but also the monitoring of environmental conditions through data loggers, if you will, and other infrastructures inside of these structures. It introduces technologies that address issues of spatial organization, urban morphologies, construction, and materials and methods of construction of buildings and building sites, as well as their 3D representation through scans and other documentations that make use of the digital environment. Students also address and record and analyze in terms of this environmental design approach, if you will, user comfort conditions and energy efficiency parameters of these buildings by examining, collecting, and interpreting and using appropriate indicators of a number of environmental data, of several environmental data. Last but not least, they address and record operational characteristics and specific user comfort requirements that include both a quantitative recording and analysis of set parameters, but such as thermal and visual comfort conditions, but also qualitative aspects that relate to siting and design. In terms of their teaching method, if you will, or their teaching approach, these usually happen face-to-face and encourage the deliberation and discussions in the classroom, and have recently tried to replicate, if you will, this studio environment of peer learning via tools such as Teams or Zoom or Miro or a bunch of other platforms that the department is making use of. Teaching has been mainly carried through both scheduled lectures, but also presentations by guest lecturers who impart their expertise to the students through specific topics. Students engage in bibliographical and literature review, and they interpret this through class assignments in the form of critical analysis papers. They do site visits and field trips to learn on-site techniques about how to record many of these buildings and sites. And then they have reviews, both final reviews and interim reviews, which are carried out by the students in a peer learning fashion with the contribution of their instructors and by guest lecturers and critics. They also tend to pick up tools on how to record and to document all key building components by recording things on data sheets, making use of, as we mentioned before, traditional and contemporary measuring instruments, such as laser meters and other related equipment, but also using more contemporary technologies and specialized equipment in recording building energy performances and user comfort aspects measuring temperature, relative humidity through the use of indoor data loggers, temperature, humidity, and CO2 levels using outdoor data loggers, and also making use of environmental weather stations, light meters, and so on and so forth. Many of these are then undergo 3D scans, 3D modeling, and 3D printing of the buildings, the sites or components of buildings or sites using 3D scanners, photogrammetry software, photo scans, modeling software, and printers. And in the next two slides, you can see how many of these tools and products make use of both traditional methods, which are also carried lately into digital and interactive environments that tend to visualize, if you will, and present information through digital modeling, but then tying this using, for example, GIS tools or building information modeling tools, or other, if you will, integrated environmental system tools, morphological information, to other related databases that include additional data about the projects examined. And again, this is the byproduct of some of the tools that have been used in this class. On a different family of courses mentioned in the beginning includes come from, if you will, the history and critical approach to conservation. This course or this family of courses provide a critical overview of existing restored building structures, historic structures, as well as their interaction or integration with new proposals, as creating inroads, if you will, for the better promotion of the values of these structures and the coexistence of the historic or listed building together with new infill proposals. The historic buildings selected have included in the past industrial complexes, monasteries, schools, a variety of public buildings or buildings coming from the public realm. Such courses provide a critical review of contemporary trends and theories on conservation and reuse of historic buildings and buildings of the modern movement lately, by providing general principles and methodological approaches that lead to the overall protection of heritage buildings and heritage sites. They entail critical analysis and knowledge of international charters and declarations on conservation, juxtaposed to local legislation, and they include the main theories of conservation, important examples of historic projects, looking at best practices, and these are in terms analyzed further through their design and visualization processes. The selected buildings have been viewed through a critical lens after collecting information, after the students have become more informed clients, if you will, of this body of knowledge, and of the development of these buildings or sites through history and through time, acknowledging the various phases of and successive layers of interventions that have added or subtracted from aspects of building from these buildings or sites, and they have also tried to evaluate these more technical analysis, if you will, through sociopolitical frameworks, examining these frameworks in the periods wherein those buildings happened and or occurred, and this is usually followed by critical analysis on the methods and approaches of rehabilitation used at those specific times. Many of these courses culminate in final projects wherein student suggestions and solutions are proposed on how to manage the problems encountered during the phases of recording of the selected structure, how their analysis project was married to these approaches, and then how they proceeded with strategic visioning and visualization suggestions with regards to design, most often with a view towards regeneration. Teaching tools, if you will, or approaches that have been used in such coursework entail the development of critical methods of analysis of important architectural works of the past and provision of knowledge and methodological tools for conservation, knowledge production via an environmental sustainable approach towards conservation through the study of the most recent international charters, as we mentioned before, but also recent strategies and best practices that have been followed and undertaken in these representative case studies. Students also take a critical look at conservation tools through time, and they receive specific or specialized seminars on contemporary trends that have been recently adopted. Training happens also by the utilization of relevant tools of investigation in approaching both theory and practice, the practice of conservation and restoration, of adaptive reuse, and the way in which these tools or approaches have been applied to buildings and complexes, both of the past, but also of the more recent modern movement building stock. It is also important for the students to understand the principles for the overall protection of buildings and complexes and the important role that the conservation of existing buildings plays towards the acquisition of a more sustainable attitude for the built environment. And last but not least, the utilization of a set of tools that enable students to recognize the environmental aspects related to these structures, and also incorporated strategies that look into the design, a holistic approach to the design of historic and vernacular structures in order to both conserve and reinforce these structures during the rehabilitation projects. So products of this specific setup and approach have looked at existing buildings. In this case, it was a carob mill in the city of Limassol, a coastal area that was closely related to port facilities, and the various phases and exercises that these students underwent, both from site visits to record and to examine specific aspects of these structures in order to then analyze, unpack, if you will, the embedded information, both tangible and intangible, inherent in these building structures, in order for them to proceed with making their own proposals. Different set of tools in this case, in which listed buildings, after selective restoration and conservation, were adaptively reused to take on a new set of requirements and a new set of users, and to coexist with new structures that have been built using a vocabulary of contemporary architecture that now needs to coexist, to interact, and to engage in spatial dialogue with the existing listed building. From the family of courses that look at urban design and regional planning, come a couple of courses that look both at the scale of the building, but also the scale of the neighborhood in terms of engaging in topics such as the contemporary territorial transformations in urban planning and design. Courses in this family or in this group of of coursework incorporate an investigation of planning principles necessary for the communication between architects, urban designers, urban planners, other agents that engage in sustainable urban planning and design, and in the rehabilitation and conservation, if you will, of buildings and sites. So finding common ground and a common language for interaction, discussion of complementary, of looking at how to complement the nature of architecture, urban design and urban planning across the various scales, if you will, in the context of sustainable development and adaptive reuse of buildings and sites. Looking here particularly at the restoration, conservation, and adaptive reuse, if you will, knowledge basis as one of the key components of what identify or are entailed in sustainable development strategies. The students here in these courses, being more advanced courses, have the ability to, if you will, manipulate, so that the students work together with the instructors to formulate a set of hypotheses and research questions. So these vary. The product of such classes varies according to the students' needs or requests, working on a more intimate basis and receiving, if you will, more personalized tutorials that match the students' if you will, research expectations with the specific instructors' research interests. Students are also introduced to the realization of aspects of juxtaposing globalization, juxtaposed to also local dynamics, and they try to add, if you will, another level of operation to the contemporary city by transgressing the limits between the center and the periphery, in these bipoles between new and old, between a small and big, building and site, for example, and so on and so forth. Students also look at the formulation of all sorts of networks, either visible or invisible, that create and control these complex dynamics that follow sustainable design and development principles between urban elements that interact not only with local territory and local authorities, but also with existing conurbations and or new elements introduced by said networks in an ongoing dialogue between what is existing and what is proposed. In terms of teaching approaches, the courses are usually organized around design workshops and the survey courses. They take into account best practices as introduced by professionals and practitioners in the fields of urban design and urban development, with a particular focus on the challenges that face Cyprus and the Eastern Mediterranean region of the Levant. An examination of the methods of analysis of existing and proposed urban conditions are also introduced to allow students to detect such dynamics, such as those mentioned above, and ways in which they can inform sustainable urban design. The question is asked as to the role of the architect and the city planner as a catalytic agent in such cases. A holistic approach, borrowing on this interdepartmental, if you will, or interscholastic nature of these courses, looks at the problematization offered by these courses through a multidisciplinary lens, if you will, and the nature of the assignments, both in terms of weekly reviews, but also in terms of final projects, looks to complement with shorter and longer assignments many of these related themes. Readers are being put together for students of many related texts that list both theoretical positions, but also case study precedents, and they include other evaluation criteria, such as course attendance and participation, because we feel that peer learning and discussion is an important aspect of the instructional model, submission of thematic reports on specialized topics, as well as interim and final presentations of assignments. Again, looking at the sustainable aspect of the equation, many of the sustainable design and development strategies are seen not only as the byproduct of appropriate design proposals, but also as having the need to be further substantiated by carrying out technical or economic analysis to ensure project feasibility with regards perhaps to financing or expected post-occupancy evaluations based on calculations of energy output that would render proposals at the building or the neighborhood scale as zero energy ventures. So in the next two slides, we can see that the byproduct, whether at the scale of the building or what is most common at the scale of a neighborhood, looks at the visualization of the territory that is being examined, but also on the schematic visualization of strategies that then become part of a tool set that may inform the induction of a kit of parts into the places that have been examined. So we look at how perhaps these schematic tools, how these tools that do not speak so much of specific spatial manifestations, but are visualizations of strategies, if you will, of these intangible concepts, can then be translated into architectural or into spatial interventions at various scales. And in this next slide, we see how indicators such as technical indicators, energy autonomy indicators, financial feasibility indicators become part of the tool set of these students as they examine this multifaceted investigation through the lens, through a lens that is characterized by its multidisciplinary, if you will, point of view. We will see in the next few slides discrete structures and approaches that come from more individualized work, whereas all the previous courses, the previous families of courses engaged mostly in group work. Some of these projects that you will see in the next few slides come from individualized study. These studies occurs usually in the frameworks of final diploma theses and designs, and are developed through analytical and compositional processes, very often investigating existing structures with proposals for their sustainable reuse. In the past, examples have included many public buildings that have been used as hotels from the 19th or early 20th century, industrial estates from the same period, mining areas or other culturally significant landscapes, or even abandoned or highly neglected villages and settlements. Also within this framework of graduate student research work, some master students engage in the individual projects that are based on theoretical on a theoretical basis and the way in which it complements and supports a design-based project. And we will see an example of looking at the family of abandoned urban houses and the way in which the student dealt with this problem. In terms of a teaching approach, here too, the development of critical methods of analysis through relevant compositional tools and strategies based on best practices are being developed in a custom-made, if you will, approach between instructor and student. And investigations introduce concepts that are based on extensive literature reviews and critical theoretical positioning, The instructors here look for critical thinking and design innovation that takes into consideration both contemporary spatial and socioeconomic aspects, in addition to the unique challenges encountered in the historic sites and buildings investigated. So these are from left to right, I mean, examples based on individual studies that have looked at conservation and adaptive reuse of a former hotel, an architectural hub within our own sort of listed university campus by second student, or even the revival of an old industrial cultural landscape by a third student. Yet other students at their diploma level have looked at the revival of traditional settlements. This is a village that was totally abandoned, but in a very unique, culturally significant site, entailing, if you will, or incorporating the ruins of some buildings that are considered significant. So students have taken into account both issues of adaptive reuse and aspects of regenerative techniques. And these are some more images from that project. Some other proposals have also looked at the reuse or completion, if you will, of existing buildings and settlements. In the case of our master students, looking at the family of, if you will, abandoned dwellings in more urban environments, this critical analysis has had the output which is indicated in this slide. Coming to the end of this presentation, we give specific emphasis to this Capstone project, which is an advanced project, which is the main graduation project for this group of students. It consists of 3 individual courses, Capstone A, B, and C, which occur in 3 consecutive semesters, usually fall, spring, and summer. So it takes a whole calendar year to complete. It is essentially a case study that combines analytical and design work and includes theoretical archival research in its approach, field work in the form of surveys informing the design process, as well as laboratory experiments and simulations on the materials used and on the methods of construction. Through this course, a close collaboration is achieved between the 3 departments. It is jointly supervised by all the participating departments, and individuals bringing together individual fields of specialization, as well as the interaction of students coming together from different disciplines. The course gives students the opportunity to become trained and acquire scientific knowledge inherent in their field, and also by osmosis, if you will, through the fields of their fellow students and instructors from other departments, while familiarizing themselves with the tools and methods of conducting historical and archaeological research at excavation sites, doing on-site design recording, and using a bunch of other equipment in gathering systematic data and analyzing it. At the same time, students expose themselves to issues of more contemporary tools that have come into play, such as digital recording and 3-dimensional scanning and modeling. The teaching approach looks at the comprehensive interdisciplinary training of students and cooperation in real-life management issues. So many of these problematizations are taken from real-life projects with the contribution, if you will, of both private practitioners, public officials, and technocrats, and industry experts. They help students to develop critical thinking and interpretative tools to approach and to define their methodologies for investigation. They provide practical experience and know-how because they are usually demonstration projects with the collaboration of all the agents I mentioned before. They're interdisciplinary in nature and require the cooperation between various group members coming from different but allied fields. They examine and try to replicate best practices, oftentimes by translating into the realities of the local context, of the local Cypriot context, or the broader context of the Eastern Mediterranean. And they engage in all sorts of recordings and recording and sampling techniques. And again, looking at the medieval manor in a village in Nicosia, you can see how all of these parameters mentioned before are being visualized in this Capstone project, looking from material studies and examinations to environmental studies, shown in these last slides. And this is how some of the strategies begin in the form of schematic design and sketches, and then are translated into very specific architectural and spatial interventions. So concluding thoughts, this is the next to last slide. I'm sorry I took perhaps a bit longer than planned. What have been some of the general learning outcomes that we are noticing or are striving or aiming for through these families of coursework, examples of which I have presented before? In terms of knowledge production, we think it's extremely important for the students to engage in a rigorous understanding of the dilemmas of environmental practices in the context of preservation, conservation, and possible adaptive reuse of listed buildings, and in the development of strategies that ensure sustainability in urban design and development projects that may mix both existing listed buildings and new constructions. It is also important to fine-tune critical questions that designers need to be asking themselves regarding environmental rhetoric and environmental protection. So the problematization aspect of formulating a research question, and then from that to come up with appropriate, if you will, methodological approaches. Last but not least, the familiarization with relevant bibliographies and literatures, theoretical concepts regarding heritage awareness and sustainability of both physical and natural landscapes creates the basis that gives the ability for critical insight into the work of these students. In terms of their skills and abilities, it's important to start through archival and library research as it is to record, to use recording tools, if you will, in conducting field research. It is important to learn how to connect specific projects and to adopt best practices from both academia, but also the profession as well. It is important to learn how to problematize larger theoretical ideas and concepts, and to be able to work at various scales. Critical reading and writing skills are also skills that are being sort of cultivated, so that people can communicate these ideas not only visually, but also verbally and in written form, and are based on a critical thinking approach that looks not only at material or spatial aspects of the equation, but also social and political aspects that have an impact on environmental strategies. And lastly, the familiarization with qualitative and quantitative tool sets through the adoption of appropriate indicators that complement and support the theoretical positioning and the data analysis and the analysis of data gathered through the recording process. The last slide is about actions that happen in parallel with the Hersus project. You may have heard earlier today about this concurrent program from an Erasmus in the Erasmus Plus context called Smart Rehabilitation, that looks at innovating professional skills for the existing building sector. So it is to create, if you will, online training courses and tools to access technological and innovative interventions in rehabilitation, with partners from Cyprus, Spain, Italy, Lithuania, and Ireland. And you heard also today about a brand new Marie Curie program that came to our university and headed by our next department head, which is called RID12 and looks at participatory planning practices through the tool of urban living labs. Thank you very much for your patience and attention.
Thank you, Professor Savvides. Are there any questions?